Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken. I'm a senior editor with the Mises Institute. And here with me, as usual, is my associate editor, Tho Bishop. And we're back again for this episode. And we were thinking about, what's going on out there other than the war proper that we can talk about. And something that keeps coming up in my news feed is Senator Lindsey Graham. And whether he's talking about some horrible thing in foreign policy, like assassinating Vladimir Putin, which we can talk a little bit about why that's a problem, and just all sorts of grandstanding around foreign policy, saying that Biden's afraid of Putin and that Graham would be so different and be far more aggressive and things like that, which, of course, I mean, he knows he's never going to have to actually do any of those things. And then he keeps coming up in my news feed around the Supreme Court nomination hearings, and his questions are always just so unimpressive, but obviously calculated for maximum political effect. So the question I then came to ask myself was, is Lindsey Graham the worst U.S. senator, or at least the worst GOP senator? No point here discussing whether Chuck Schumer's a bad guy. I'm sure most of our audience is already hip to that idea. But let's talk about who's the worst GOP senator and why. And you can talk a little bit, too, though, about how we break that down, that there's different types of bad in the Senate. So I guess I'll just give it to you as to start us off as a yes or no question. Is Lindsey Graham the worst GOP senator?
I've been thinking about this ever since you raised the question, and it's very difficult to come to mind someone worse than Lindsey Graham. Now, I think there's a variety of different aspects to this that are worth exploring. The first of which is there are different sort of roles in being in the Senate, right? Like you can be a pure sort of ideologue, which to a certain extent, Graham kind of plays this role, particularly in today's politics, by being kind of the last standing classical neoconservative in the truest sense, right? He doesn't try to, we tend to have a lot of people in the Senate that vote like neocons in policy, but they're not intellectual enough to make pronounced defenses of, a Pax Americana sort of worldview, right? They're not out there traveling to, I think that he was, standing right alongside Azov Battalion circa 2014, right? What you could give Lindsey Graham to, he will go to any photo op, as close to, he's not afraid of going closer to the war zone for that grand photo op there. And so I think that he very much plays the sort of ideological keeper of the true neocon flame, the way that perhaps no one else is. And I think that sort of role is very different than, say, the McConnell role, right, where, he votes very poorly, but he's incredibly powerful in the way that he can use sort of parliamentary procedure to his point, to certain ends, right? Like he's very aggressive on, with the Supreme Court appointments and kind of judicial appointments generally, right? Not just the Supreme Court, but some of those other federal courts. And so at least, for all the bad that McConnell has, and there's a lot there, there's sort of a game that he plays with his position and leadership that Graham doesn't have.
Well, before you move on from him, and bringing up McConnell, that makes me think of it, right? Yeah. Who's the worst is a totally different question from who's the most powerful U.S. senator. And so maybe then you could sort of handicap these guys on, I would say McConnell's probably a very powerful senator. Although ideologically kind of neutral, and by neutral I mean bad, but in Washington terms. But yeah, does this actually increase Graham's power, or is he just really doing all of this posturing or saying these horrible things because he knows it gets him reelected? I've never been quite sure as to what the motivation is there.
Well, definitely there's power that comes with seniority, and he was very effective at playing the personal touch with Trump, which again goes to issues with Trump and how easy it was to flatter him on the case of bad people. But that is one aspect to it where Graham's power is that he's more, again, I think, and this kind of goes to the previous point, I think he's more clever than your average senator, right? plenty of reasons not to like the guy, but he is, he gets those sort of, he's good at the occasional one-liner, right? Like, even if you look back in like the old history of Lindsey Graham, he was noted for being, a wittier than your average politician. I'm willing to grant him that, but that kind of itself made him dangerous during the Trump years, where he was kind of playing that backroom game. Within terms of the parliamentary procedure of the Senate itself, right? He's still not, majority leader. He's got the power that comes with seniority, and so that's an aspect to it. But he also plays, I think it's interesting right now. We have the judicial nomination going on for, the new Supreme Court justice nominee. And that's one of those areas where Graham often has a very pronounced role within the Republican side. And if you look at his history, it's kind of the worst of all worlds sort of situation when it comes to these nominations. Like, for one, he's historically been, playing up to this myth of, Supreme Court justice nominations should be beyond partisanship, as if that is such a thing, right? He maintains that sort of myth of institutional neutrality. And then he was very good at showing off like the anger after the Kavanaugh treatment. And yet, when it actually comes to applying, now, and again, Kavanaugh himself was a bad Republican judicial nominee. He was someone very much in the Lindsey Graham mold, former Bush guy. So bad from that perspective as well, where, there's an ideological alignment there. But like, you see it translated today, and, Lindsey Graham would rather whine about the way Kavanaugh was treated in, 2018 than give similar sort of treatment to who is supposed to be, right, the enemy class. And of course, that kind of goes to the problem of Lindsey Graham. I think one of the defining images of the Trump election stuff is that he would go on television news and talk about how Trump shouldn't concede, right? And he'd kind of play this good superficial game regarding the election, but then he's fist bumping Kamala Harris, right, like on the Senate floor when push comes to shove, and you actually have the procedure side of it. So you have that dynamic where he's good at playing a very personal game to conservatives, while any sort of power he has simply goes to fuel and grow the regime itself.
And for the people at home, as they say, I should probably get a little bit more specific, and this will fill out a little bit what you're saying, right? Is that in recent days, it's been very aggressive on foreign policy. Talking about how someone needs to take out Vladimir Putin. And the problem with that then is that, as has always been the case with diplomacy and war, is that when you start threatening the other side immediately with war crimes tribunals and regime change and reprisals beyond simply preventing that foreign leader from achieving his war aims, is now what you're basically doing is giving that person a reason to double down. So now if Putin believes that regime change is something that the U.S. would really pursue, which I don't think he thinks that, I think he just thinks that in this case, Lindsey Graham's just blowing smoke. But if Graham managed to get more people to his side and get kind of a chorus going of that, then the belief might be that the plan was regime change in Russia. And then that just means that the Russian state should engage in whatever means is necessary to win the war, stay in power, do that sort of thing. Whereas it'd be a totally different calculation if the U.S. policy was for sure, well, we have no interest in regime change, we just want to get you out of Ukraine or get a ceasefire. Those are two very different situations. And so that's why you can certainly describe what Graham is doing as reckless. And then he's kind of skirted the issue of the no-fly zone, which is basically the same thing as calling for war with Russia, a nuclear armed power. And he's given a little bit of support, I think. He's not been ready to quite come out and say, oh, yeah, I'm for an unconditional no-fly zone. But I think he's provided aid and comfort, if you will, to people like Roger Wicker from Mississippi, who've been much more gung-ho on the idea of a no-fly zone. And if we look back, as you say, he's been really the sort of guy who said a lot of the most aggressive stuff. He's really been a pal of John McCain on a lot of these issues, on Iran, on Iraq, and just terrible on those issues. And one of the things I perhaps miss is Justin Raimondo making fun of Lindsey Graham. Boy, did Raimondo hate Graham. And I would never write a column the way Raimondo did, because it was often very personal and over the top. But boy, I enjoyed reading those columns, and often Graham was the target of his ire. And I mean, that just is a reminder how long this guy's been around. I mean, I can't remember when he came in, but it's, of course, been at least since the Iraq War days. And it's always just been kind of the same story on this, is try to ramp up war, more escalation. And a lot of the time, it's even at odds with the more sane people in his own party, which back during the Iraq War days was saying a lot, because U.S. policy was just absolutely bonkers back then. And the number of civilians Americans were willing to kill in Fallujah and elsewhere in Iraq was really quite staggering. But so that's what we're talking about when we talk about what a traditional neocon type that Graham is that there was really, in the last 30 years, as far as I've seen, never a war that Graham saw that he didn't like, and certainly was at times the glue that held people like John McCain with other U.S. senators, and so made the situation a lot worse in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Graham himself, he came to the Senate in 2002, so he's kind of like a true Iraq War baby, at least within his presence in that body. He was a congressman prior to that. He was actually part of the group that tried to get rid of Newt Gingrich in his leadership as speaker at one point. He was a big, Bill Clinton hawk, that sort of stuff. So yeah, he very much, his career in the Senate has forever been marked with his, very aggressive support for military policy. He's also had the photo ops aspect. I can't imagine he's still in there, but I know he used to be part of the Air Force National Guard for a while, and so he'd come up in uniform and occasionally get medals. All the sort of perks that come with serving well in the Senate. And one of the other aspects of it, though, is that he's not simply a senator from, say, a moderate purple state. He's a senator from South Carolina. And there are some consequences that come with that. South Carolina politics themselves are kind of weird, right? This is Mark Sanford's former state. So at a time, the same year that Lindsey Graham became senator, Mark Sanford was rising within Republican South Carolina politics at the same time. And so here you have a state being represented on one hand, by one of the most hawkish politicians, while also their governor being one of the least hawkish politicians. For all the other issues with Mark Sanford that came after, it's just very interesting. A state as red as South Carolina, in its own kind of the history of South Carolina politics is quirky in its own right. Some very bombastic sort of figures from American history come from that fine state. That's another aspect where, again, like the opportunity costs here. This is a state that should be providing, one of the sounder senators relative to the rest of the country, and yet instead we get good old Lindsey.
Well, so that takes us to some of these other guys who I think about when I think of some of the most irresponsible senators on foreign policy, at least. Senator Hawley, Cotton. I'm not sure who else I would put on. I generally think of those three guys when I'm thinking of foreign policy. Well, and Cruz been pretty bad on Iran and the Iran deal. And all of these guys, they keep showing up in my feed because they seem to be the most masterful at politicking in terms of Senate hearings about things. They know how to ask some of the most drama-laden questions and those sorts of things. But I'm not as familiar really with what their policies are. They seem to be, when you're in a situation where you've got guys like Marco Rubio who seem like responsible adults in that he was opposed to open warfare with Russia. I mean, it's a pretty low bar. But some of these guys seem to be these guys who make Rubio look reasonable by comparison. But maybe their policies that they actually embrace are different, and what they say in all of these hearings and they say on the Senate floor are different. That's the thing, is it's always just difficult to tell without following it closely. And that's what I've noticed about Cruz is often the actual policies he promotes are often very terrible, whereas the things he says in the Senate make you think that, oh, gee, what a sane guy, he's on our side. But then the actual votes that he makes are pretty bad. And so I don't know if there's maybe a senator who looks terrible but is pretty good on policy, or vice versa.
Cruz is also, he's great at trying to win over people. I mean, I remember back during his presidential campaign, he was doing an interview with a libertarian website, and he went out of his way to talk about how he's read Mises's Bureaucracy and Murray Rothbard. So like he knew enough to like name drop, certain things within a Ron Paul sort of crowd. But again, though, it pays. When it actually comes out to a lot of his legislation, it is not particularly Misesian, Rothbardian by any means, right? Hawley's an interesting case of those three because he's someone who he's perhaps the leading China hawk within the Republican side, but he is someone who takes, when it comes to issues like Russia, he is not particularly aggressive on that front. He's someone who is better than average on the Middle East. I think he's someone who was pushing for complete withdrawal prior to Biden doing it, right? And did not try to make the counter argument that we should go back because it was a disaster, yada yada yada. His whole thing has been that we should redirect our foreign policy away from the war on terror and antagonizing Russia, and to that sort of focus on China. I think that he is perhaps more open to actions regarding China that I would personally find concerning, right? But I do think on some of those other sort of traditional foreign policy things, he's a little more interesting than he might seem. I mean, something with Hawley, though, is that he's an example of one of these people that are filling that void in that populist right. And so it's very easy to applaud when they take very bold theatrical and often, righteous stands against certain institutions, deep state sort of issues. And yet they are also very aggressive in what they are pitching as the counter policies to the status quo. And that's where some of Hawley's stuff, on economic policy, he can kind of, be like, Christian Elizabeth Warren at times, right? There's some things that I think that he's comfortable with as the alternative to what's currently going on, where like he kind of it makes him bad kind of in his own sort of niche there. Again, if we're thinking about different sort of senatorial archetypes, he's an opposition that wants to lead things in a very bad direction. So we have a lot of common enemies, but not a lot of common goals. Whereas someone like Ted Cruz, like he talks a good like sort of Tea Party game, and he's someone who's hated by the right people. I think he's the most hated senator in the Republican side. I always thought that was an argument for trying to put him in the Supreme Court, that he's someone that would fly by 99 to nothing, because all of the rest of his colleagues would want him out of their chamber. And then of course Tom Cotton, he really is sort of the young buck of, I think, the neoconservative wing of things. Very much a turn it to glass sort of guy. He was actually on my committee, on the Financial Services Committee, his first year. I'm not going to say that he isn't probably smarter than most of your average members of Congress. That's not a particularly difficult feat. But he's got like dead eyes. Like you look at him in his eyes, and it's like there's something not quite right there. And again, when it comes to foreign policy decisions, that's where you should really start being concerned about where this may lead.
Well, the guys like that, when I worked at the legislature, right, I always knew guys who did eventually go on to the U.S. Senate. In a couple of cases, and they think strictly in terms of slogans, in terms of everything they say is about, will this get me reelected? Which interest groups will this upset or gain me favor with? These people are like robots in that everything is a calculation in terms of how will this affect my standing in the chamber or my ability to get reelected and so on. And there's just never a word that comes out of their mouth that isn't a calculated sentence designed to do these sorts of things. Now they're not all like that, but a lot of them are the ones that, as you say, have the dead eyes, and so it is a specific personality type for sure.
Well, and what's interesting is that historically, the Senate was full of serious people. right? People that usually had very bad ideologies. Particularly throughout the 20th century, right? There's not a great people we can kind of point to and say, golly gosh darn, like they really know what's going on. But like you kind of got the best of the mainstream political ideologies of the day. And I think that's one of the things with the way that politics has sort of changed over the years and has become just fundamentally less serious and less ideological in terms of content and debate. It's one thing you can kind of coast by playing kind of the pure campaign game in the House to a certain extent. In the Senate, when you're dealing with a statewide election and things like that, it was a harder sort of sell. I do think we've got a lot lower quality intellect within the Senate in some of the more recent generations, which is also not to say that they're all bad. I think Rand Paul, fairly new still to this day, obviously more intelligent than your average senator, right? Mike Lee, I like better than most. Cynthia Lumens is someone who is very strong on crypto. I think she's much better than average. And then even some of these other figures we're talking about, I don't think they're necessarily, they're more intellectual than your average congressman. But you think of someone like Kamala Harris, right? Representing California, of all places. I think Chuck Schumer, even in that role of party leader, he is not nearly as effective as wielding power there as someone like a Harry Reid was, right? I don't think there's someone who's going to follow Mitch McConnell who's going to be kind of very similar in stature. And so there's also, I think, just as there is with many other American institutions, a steady decline in the intellectual capabilities broadly of the fine folks we're sending to America's Senate these days.
Once upon a time, it wasn't all that unusual to have senators write books, and not like campaign books, right? Not like a Hillary Clinton book, like a book that involved like real research and actual information. Boy, I don't know the last time that actually happened from any U.S. senator, but it certainly hasn't been recently. But you would get these guys from the Northeast who were very much tied into their local communities or the history of their state. And they saw themselves as some sort of scholar. Now, that doesn't mean I always agreed with those guys or I thought they weren't part of the deep state or that they weren't doing a tremendous damage because they had bad ideology or in some cases bad even motivations and meant ill will to a lot of people. But I'm not going to deny that some of them were fairly learned and intelligent. Of course, maybe you have to be more afraid of those people. So maybe they did more damage because they were more intelligent and that was the problem. So yeah, maybe when having a Senate full of morons isn't quite as bad, that everything's just at a standstill because they can't think any deeper than just what partisan hackery. And that's why no legislation ever seems to actually get passed, except some tiny little pieces that, of course, are usually bad. But then it's all just about spending. What extra $1 trillion spending can we do this month? It is certainly different in that way, but it's always hard to say if things are actually getting worse or not in the short term.
Well, see, I think I've developed a very strong opinion on this, and I think this is a bad thing. And I think it's because, again, while there is, I think, a consequence of having sort of true ideological believers when they believe their own ideology in these positions, a true believer is harder to manipulate than an empty vessel. And you did very much, often the last name of the senator used to matter a lot more, right? You'd have families of statewide politics. And since these were far harder elections to run on a statewide basis, right, you see sort of the family names, and so these are people that tended to come up within, back when universities were actually institutions of higher learning, right? You kind of get that natural elite aspect a little bit, again, not perfect, but more average than other political positions, and that just because of the high barriers of entry. But I think it's precisely the fact that you have senators that are increasingly like representatives. With fewer election cycles, that these are the people the most manipulated by the bureaucracy, right? These are the people most manipulated by congressional staffers, and these are the ones that are isolated from the democratic mechanism. And while I understand, as we have discussed in a podcast in the past, that there are downfalls to that democratic mechanism. I think as long as they exist symbolically, there is very much that non-elected political class is detrimental, and the less intellect we have in the Senate, the harder it is for the people that are actually in those chairs making that final decision and to vote. Having a lower quality leads to a lot more of the monopolization within kind of the non-elected sphere. It increases their power at the expense of the rest. And so I've now become, I'd much rather have, people with bad ideas that they firmly believe in than this, given the quality of the swamp, have them kind of going along with the games. Whereas, there are situations, just as the counterexample to that, though, there are examples where like the swamp might be better than your average intellect. And so there are certain situations where if you've got like all the right sort of interest groups and kind of alignment there, where the swamp is actually trying to push like good policy, I think there's some state level kind of swampy ecosystems where like you have a very strong, good think tank that actually can kind of, in that case, having them blindly listen to them, that'd be a good Senate, right? Like that'd be a senator better than average. But given just how awful DC is, I think we're there's a negative consequence to an increasingly shallow intellectual group.
Yeah, I think at the state and local level, it's more of a crapshoot as to whether you're dealing with a good mixture of people who maybe have an ideological viewpoint that isn't totally horrible. But in Washington, it tends to be generally reliably bad. And you and I have talked about this issue before in a couple of contexts. One was term limits, right? I don't think we've ever talked about that here on Radio Rothbard, but the issue of term limits is a lot of people think that will solve problems. And I think one can argue the point, but the big problem you run into is that you get a constant churn of legislators coming and going, but there is no churn in the permanent government. That is the people who've been bureaucrats in Washington for 20 years. Your CIA guys that have been there forever. So you get some new guy with no experience on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, and then the CIA shows up and says, well, this is what the truth is. And the guy says, oh, okay, I guess that must be true. And the other context we talked about that then was how libertarians sometimes praise people for not knowing anything about foreign policy, as if this was some sort of virtue. And so, hey, I don't know where Iraq is on a map. I don't know where Syria is, and I don't know anything about it. And then you'd get all of these self-professed anarcho-capitalist types saying, yeah, well, if he doesn't believe in if he doesn't know about these countries, then he's not going to want to bomb them. Not realizing, of course, that that's not how foreign policy is made. It's not just the president hands down what his decisions are. He's surrounded by advisors. And if he's surrounded by advisors who know 10,000 times more than he does, well, guess who he's going to end up siding with and believing. And so, yeah, you need well-informed people. And probably a good example of that and how only an informed person could actually push back would maybe be, and this is an example of a guy who wrote actual books, was Daniel Patrick Moynihan from New York. And he actually really did oppose the CIA in the Senate and had called for its abolition and forwarded legislation on that. And he couldn't be bullied by people who knew about foreign policy also because he knew about it. And he also pointed out the CIA managed to get everything wrong all the time. Every important thing they got wrong, whether it was the 1979 revolution in Iran, whether it was the state of the economy in the old Soviet Union, Bay of Pigs, all of that. The CIA was wrong for any time it really made a difference. And he said, what are we paying these people for? But I think only someone with that level of expertise could probably get away with lasting more than 5 minutes with a position like that.
Yeah. And I'm feeling Cory Booker is not up for that task if I had to bet.
Well, no, I mean, a lot of these guys who just kind of appear from nowhere too and into the Senate, and Booker didn't even have any congressional experience before that, did he? He was I think he went straight to the mayor, from the mayor's position to. Okay. Yeah. No, of course I don't have any problem with being
he had a
mayor.
documentary though. Like that's the whole thing. That he had a very popular documentary though, and he used that to kind of, because I think that's also an interesting dynamic too. Because like if you think about it, very rarely did someone go from the Senate into the White House, and then Barack Obama did, running against another senator. So but still, so someone was going to have to win that one. But But I think that's also kind of changed a little bit, that dynamic where, historically that senatorial role wouldn't be seen as an obvious stepping stone for the White House, even though obviously, it's less obvious than other positions perhaps. Whereas now it's, the Obama model is definitely an archetype. And so you get someone like a Cory Booker, who's kind of a media creation, right? You get some of those things going on where it's I think Kirsten Gillibrand, right, of New York, and they run for the White House, and again, neither of them were particularly successful because again, it's difficult to go from the Senate to the White House. But what the path that Obama pioneered for some of these sort of personalities also probably plays a role in the declining intellectual quality of our senatorial class.
Well, as a kind of our last part of this before we move on to the Supreme Court thing is, you noted when I saw you in Auburn was it's really just about a dozen or so senators that make the news as senators. Because I said to you, I'm like, I saw some new senators the other day. I'd never even heard of these people. So I didn't know, and I've been watching the Senate for a long time, right? Now, of course, I don't watch every election, so new people come in that I've never heard of. But I'm always a little bit surprised when it's a couple years after an election and someone pops up, like Wicker. I never heard of Wicker from Mississippi before this. I don't know if he's new or not. Maybe he's just been flying under the radar all of this time. But so there's a lot of senators out there who they never say anything. They're just working on their reelection. They vote as the party tells them to vote. There's just not a lot there in terms of any controversy or personality. But so, if you had to name 5, if you're someone who actually cared about laissez-faire, peace, prosperity, free markets, who would you say are the senators that you need to be most careful of, right? Everybody knows, okay, the Democrats we gotta be real careful of those people. But on the GOP side, who is it who is perhaps doing the most damage? And then maybe from this we can extrapolate as to who the worst senator is. But there's got to be a core group, right?
Yeah, who's doing the most damage is itself a interesting dynamic there, because in particular right now, you have a lot of sort of broad, all the worst damage is when there's kind of bipartisan sort of agreement, right? And so you've got a lot of the really squishy moderate types, where like Richard Shelby, who's on his way out, but looks like it's going to be replaced by a woman who is going to be ideologically Richard Shelby. Lisa Murkowski and Suzanne Collins are the obvious go-to moderate squishes. These are sort of people that's always waiting with bated breath on how they're going to vote on the Senate issues and things like that, because of both are pro-choice Republicans, and that always often comes up. It'd be easier to kind of narrow down who I think are better than average. Because kind of the broad assumption, again, this the problem is that even within red states, a lot of the red state, die hard. Arkansas has 2 senators, both of them are bad, and they're bad for different reasons. Tom Cotton's just really bad on foreign policy, and Boozman is just generic. It's very just troubling up and down the line. Alaska's got 2 bad senators. Alabama, the best senator is Tommy Tuberville, who again was not put in that position because of his knowledge of civics. I can tell you that right now. It's very it's difficult to find a lot of talent on the Republican side of things. But people I think are better than average, and perhaps some, there's the obvious ones like Rand and Mike Lee, I think is out there most. And, and at least if you're looking at crypto, Cynthia Lumens is good. Ted Cruz at least will talk a good game about crypto. We'll see how that might change. If I can get, a few of these senators to vote for eliminating taxes on gold, silver, and cryptocurrency the next time the Republicans take up a bill, then I don't care how bad Ted Cruz is on just about any other issue. I'll take that as a win and count him as a friend. John Kennedy from Louisiana is very interesting. He's on the banking committee, and he's not. I'm not going to say he's an Austrian, but he's got a kind of a good common sense sort of grasp of things. And he's got a great sort of Southern sort of draw to him. So he's someone that if you're watching a Fed hearing, Kennedy's someone that you might want to pay attention to, because again, he's been very he's been a pretty good hawk relative to the rest of the Senate, and he's entertaining while doing it. Pat Toomey is another one who, he's a former Club for Growth guy. Again, plenty of issues where even on economic policy, I'd say bad, but he holds his own. I've had some conversations with some of his staffers behind the scenes because they were interested in sort of the Austrian take on the Fed stuff. So again, more intellectual than most, and he can hold his own in a monetary hearing. He was hostile to Judy Shelton, who was someone I personally liked. So, don't agree with him all the time, but he's more interesting than most. The problem is then you go beyond that. You've got a lot of just lightweights, like James Langford from Oklahoma, total lightweight. Hopefully he's out of there. And a lot of these you can kind of judge whether they're going for, what are the issues that these senators prioritize on bills that either aren't going to go anywhere anyway, or, particularly when you're out of power. And it kind of shows what their true sort of priorities are. And more often than not, like these are the sort of people that, Mary Capito from West Virginia. Again, West Virginia is like, a state so red that, the Democrat mansion is holding up the Biden administration. Mary Capito votes no differently than if she was a moderate Republican that squeaks out a win in New Hampshire, or something like that. So those are some of the most disappointing ones because of their district. Ron Johnson from Wisconsin is another guy I think is a little more interesting than most. But again, you just go up and down the Republican bench, and there's not a whole lot of people that you can get excited about. I mean, and of course this is why it makes sense why it's a body that Mitt Romney is seen as one of the more intellectual figures, and it's not serious. Rick Scott from Florida is an interesting senator. Plenty I disagree with, like, there's plenty of stuff that when he was governor I didn't particularly like. He's interesting though because like he was very much kind of a proto-Trump, where he was a self-funded billionaire, and unlike Trump, he really made a lasting mark on the party structure within Florida. And so he's someone who has money and is willing to think outside the obvious box about how to invest that money to increase his influence on the actual mechanics of political power. And so the first thing he did, he was elected in 2018. We're going now into the 2022 election cycle. He made himself chairman of the Republican Congressional Senate Committee, which is it was a very ambitious role. Like that's where you're out there trying to identify candidates to run for offices, fundraising for them, growing your caucus's side of the Senate staff. And so, and he's also going out there trying to promote ideas where Mitch McConnell is like, hey, we've got this thing in the bag. Let's not run on anything so we don't have to do anything. We don't have any promises that we have to keep, when we actually take power. And that gives us like maximum flexibility to do Mitch McConnell things, right? Scott is trying to say, no, we need a positive we need a positive agenda. Here's some of the stuff I'm promoting. Again, not all of it perfect. Plenty that disagree with Rick Scott. But again, that's just interesting when we think about, when we have so many spineless Republican senators, even the ones that have a spine that we don't necessarily consider allies are worth taking note and trying to navigate this landscape.
Well, we missed our opportunity to rip on Mitt Romney. I don't know how he escaped.
That's just low-hanging fruit, right? Like you can get Mitt Romney bashing anywhere. This is a high intellect show. Yeah.
We'll have to come back then the next time he says something horrible. Keep in mind, Mitt Romney's been nominated. We just didn't really have much time to discuss him in any detail. But just as a final note on the Senate then, right, I assume they're going to approve Judge Jackson to the Supreme Court. That seems to me to be a given. And it just watching the hearings to a limited extent has really just highlighted for me just how pointless the hearings are from like a policy or ideological perspective, right? It's there's nothing here that they will discover about the person at this point because they already had the opposition research out there trying to dig up dirt, and apparently they couldn't find something sufficient. And if they had found it, they'd be asking about it. And so that didn't work. And so now it's just like dumb questions about little things, or can you define what a woman is and all of that stuff. And even right? I'm not sympathetic to sex change operations for 5-year-olds or anything like that. But even I appreciate that the legal definition of a woman might be something specific or something relevant, just like the legal definition of vegetable is different than the legal definition of then what a gardener might consider a vegetable to be, right? So when these things get into my social media feed, I'm like, this is the best the Senate can do, right, in terms of vetting judges.
So I do think that shows like the issue with the "I'm not a biologist" sort of answer, though, is because like, okay, well, what is the legal definition?
Well, that would be a good follow-up question, wouldn't it?
Right.
Yes.
Right.
But we didn't get that question.
Yeah.
So because he was just making a political point, right?
Right. And Holly's been very interesting, I think, on this. Again, this is an example of what I think is good Holly, and that he tried to make a big deal over reductions in sentences dealing with child porn, and it deals with and her argument is that the statutes for child porn we're dealing with outdated technology, right? Like, and so the amount of effort that went into distributing child porn was different than, you click something on the internet. And the problem, she wasn't trying to make an argument, so like that was her argument. I didn't really take her argument to mean like someone's accidentally like clicking on a site that they don't know, and therefore that because I see that as kind of perhaps a valid defense. But I don't. But I don't know what really from the action of the crime. Right? There's not a labor theory of value when it comes to crime. Right? If you spend 4 hours murdering someone, or you shoot them dead, I don't really think that changes the legal. I'm not neither here nor here. I'm not a biologist.
I think that would make a difference with a jury, whether you beat someone to death or you accidentally pulled the trigger on something.
But like it's but even things like this are going to have no impact, right? And you're not even going to have this isn't even going to be like a nail biter where it's going to be like, is Suzanne Collins and Lisa Murkowski going to? So no, like you're going to end up having the majority of these Republicans, all these no-namers, all these backbenchers, the very sort of Republicans that your average Fox News viewer can't name. Those are going to be the people that are going to just pass this through because golly gosh darn, it's going to be I disagree with her politics, but I'm so proud of she's a great legal mind and no one can disagree. It's like that's this is the role that these Republicans play is to prop up the regime and to repeat the same propaganda, and even to a certain extent, when it came down to Kavanaugh, like it wasn't until you had that sort of pedal to the insanity of the specific allegations made and the whole media circus where that itself even became a partisan sort of battle line. But yeah, like it's going to require something like that to it's going to require a reality show aspect to it for Republicans to show any sort of backbone.
Well, I think
though of course we had a very similar sort of. It was very much on partisan grounds. We were dealing with Amy Coney Barrett, so perhaps I'm not giving Democrats enough power for standing a partisan line on these sort of things. But again, the Republicans on this question are completely useless, and there's no doubt that there's going to be a 60+ majority for this.
Yeah,
thing.
There's a couple of important points there, right? One is this continued issue of, is this judge qualified? And that's going to determine whether I vote yes or no, which is just nonsense, right? Anyone who's a savvy politician, policymaker, knows that it's never been about, is a person qualified? This is what they tell naive idiots who get into the Senate, that there are traditions here and we follow these traditions, and if you vote along partisan lines and you let ideology be your guide, you're somehow doing it wrong. When the reality is that's when you're doing it right, is when you're actually willing to stand up for some sort of ideological point and you're willing to buck the rules of an institution like the Senate. Those are the people who make an actual difference. And all the people you're talking about who are like, well, we can't really pass judgment, and I don't want to cause any trouble with the nomination process. And Bill Anderson had a good article on this, I think last week or the week before, on how the Supreme Court nominations have never been about whether you're qualified or not. It's never been a meritocracy based on some notion of legal skill or your professionalism as a judge. No. It's been about, do you check certain ideological boxes? And everybody seems to be concerned about, well, she's a black woman, so she's only checking a box. It's always about checking a box, right? What is your position on abortion? What is your position on some other issue that is important for your reelection? And that's what it's about. And Bill outlined, my go-to person was always Earl Warren, who was blatantly appointed because he supported Eisenhower. But Bill goes into a bunch of the examples of people nominated under FDR, and that they were reliable supporters of the New Deal, and that's why they got nominated, and people didn't really want to ask too many uncomfortable questions about that person, and that's what it really came down to, was were you a good ally for Roosevelt and the New Deal? And it's always been that way. And so, yeah, if you call your senator's office and he tells you, well, he or she is a qualified candidate, that's just total nonsense. It's a complete cop-out that you're getting from your senator. Of course, it's always impossible to know if they actually believe that or not, or if they're just lazy.
John Marshall, right? Like this isn't even like a 20th century modernity sort of issue. Like goes back to the very beginning. Like John Marshall is there because he's a loyal Federalist and sticking it to the Jeffersonians, right? And he was very good at that.
Well, and the other half of your point was that this just really makes no difference, right? I guess maybe the questions about, do you know what a woman is and stuff, maybe temporarily help highlight that these people's values are not your values, but it's all going to be forgotten about as soon as these people get their nomination through.
Well, the interesting thing is that, and this is something where I might push back a little bit, because one of the things that you have just rising within the national consciousness is critical race theory. And in the case of Judge Brown, like, she has referenced, critical race theory style literature in the past as being influential on her worldview. I'm not going to try to argue that there's a very clear and obvious bias within her record as a judge. I haven't spent that much time going through it, to be perfectly honest with you. But even that's an aspect that it has come up in questions. I think that is something that will be obvious to see in terms of future decisions. I think that's something that and if you continue to see critical race theory in this kind of larger awareness that there is a very distinct ideology grounding the legal system that we have long thought, been told is non-ideological, but now here very much is a very firm ideological perspective baked into the decision making, and will probably be referenced explicitly with the way that certain things are worded, dealing with systemic racial oppression and yada yada yada. That's something where it would be interesting to see if, having this all play out, does this become sort of a recurring critique of Brown's decisions going forward if the right stays interested on that issue? And that this is all up to subjection. If you look at history, I think you're always safe betting on people will forget and move on. But I don't think this is always the case. And so that will be just another aspect. Well, it'd be interesting to see, how does this decision, this appointment, age going forward, particularly when you consider just what I think is going to be a very weak political legacy of Biden himself. If there's something about her that, again, particularly when you had that sort of initial pushback, right, of Biden's going for a token diversity pick that's going to check the right boxes, if that plays into perceptions of critical race theory playing a role in her decision-making, it'll be interesting to see if this continues this sort of otherwise gradual reduction in the faith and trust that Americans have within the Supreme Court as an institution itself, which is something else that we would probably see, in spite of disagreeing perhaps with those decisions, that erosion of above it all sort of integrity. That's something that we might see as a upside as part of this general sort of delegitimizing of this federal regime broadly.
Yes. Okay, you're right. I completely changed my mind. I'm all in favor.
There you go.
I'm all in favor of these sorts of scoring points in the Senate stuff. I guess the only bad thing about the Senate's the scoring points with gotcha questions is that it gives the impression that the senators are better than they are.
Right.
Because they're saying lots of things that make a lot of sense ideologically, and then they turn around and have horrible votes. So, okay, that's the only downside. The upside is, as you say, right? And of course, you can see, how solidified my opinions are coming into Radio Rothbard. It's
that transgenic
folks. If I write it down in a column, it's a little different than when I just mouth off about something in Radio Rothbard. But okay, so think about how the internet would help this too, right? So we ask a bunch of gotcha questions now, and so now we got all these great clips, right? Mm-hmm. Clips which I find tiresome because it's always just, the stonewalling, the politician trying to make themselves look good and everything. However, they do serve a purpose, as you point out. So, they hand down a Supreme Court decision. We've got all these clips of this person giving stupid answers or obviously biased answers for some crazy position, right? Or just completely refusing to answer something when we all know what they really think. And so they hand down a decision. We see how they sign the decision, and then we can just start playing all those clips again. And in that process, highlighting what a profoundly political institution the Supreme Court is, after all. So it's this great synergy then of these seemingly pointless gotcha questions, which then turn into YouTube clips or clips on Odyssey, or because they'll all be deleted from YouTube, right? Once YouTube finds that they're politically problematic. Right. Yeah. So we'll watch them on some other streaming service, and then that will then just be a reminder about this person is just they're just a hack then voting on this case in the way that supports their political position. And of course, that's been the way it's been for most of the judges forever. But now we have mounting evidence of it, right? Because sure, 30 years ago, you didn't have these clips. You didn't have as many of these questions. There weren't as many opportunities, I think, to really kind of draw out and expose the opinions and the political nature of a lot of these judges. I think they hid it better, perhaps in the past. And so, okay, sure, I think that's good. But of course, she's going to get nominated and may be in there for 20, 30 years, for all I know. But I guess the most we can hope for then is that it will undermine the confidence that the public has in the Supreme Court.
Right. Yes. I think this is one of my favorite, consistent positions is that we should be pro vulgar mudslinging within politics, because the more that we see this circus, this WWE style absurdity for what it is, the easier it is for the credibility of this entire process to go down the eyes of our neighbors and friends. And I think that is where we win, is with the delegitimization of these very powerful and horrible institutions.
Well, the truth is we have to
much better than any sort of reform.
Yeah, absolutely. And the horrible damage that was done mid-20th century, right, when the center left managed to win over people to this absurd idea that there was this national liberal consensus and that all these institutions like the Senate, like the White House, have all these venerable traditions that we must follow, and that politics was somehow civil for a long time, and that if some presidential candidate says something nasty about some other candidate, that they're somehow turning the great venerable traditions of Washington on its head. Of course, this is just all nonsense invented like in 1946 for the most part, and then people who were brought up as school children in that period somehow learned to believe it. But it's ahistorical, really, beyond just a few decades in the mid-20th century. And so, yeah, maybe we're starting to see the collapse of that. And sure, if embarrassing questions for SCOTUS nominees helps accomplish that, then fine. I'm all for it.
I agree.
So what's going to be the situation in the Senate come November? Are they going to widen their lead? Is it going to still be half and half? What's the story there?
I think they're definitely going to win enough seats to take the majority. The question of how many seats is an open question. Also, what the makeup's going to be. There's actually still some of these seats kind of up in the air in terms of who's going to be like the Republican nominee. There's been some favorable polling out of your background of Colorado. which is interesting. New Hampshire is a state that seems to be in play. There's a new Bitcoin candidate that just jumped in that I've been I'm interested to see. Because it's one of there's an interesting dynamic with this red wave sort of scenario that we're looking at, because the more seats the Republicans win, the stronger it makes Mitch McConnell or Kevin McCarthy or the old guard, because it gives them enough of a margin to kind of trust that the few really ideological people can kind of be overcome by just going with the majority of the masses that are the spineless molding sort of class in Republican politics. And so my fear is that the Republicans are going to perform better than any high expectation that could have been had a year ago, which is how bad things are going to be in the country. And that might actually only serve to strengthen Mitch McConnell in his role as leadership, rather than seeing someone mount a challenge. And it could also kind of create some leverage issues in terms of trying to pass policies, right? Where if you need every single Republican vote to get something done, then someone like Rand Paul as a standalone vote has a lot more influence, right? And so I like those sort of choke point things. If the Republicans end up winning 4 or 5 seats, they might not have that problem. So it'll be very interesting.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that. We'll come back to this, of course, as the election gets closer, and we'll be back with another episode of Radio Rothbard in the near future. And so we'll see you next time.